What's the chapter start with? Yeah, strange way to start the book, about the atomic bomb. But it's certainly very much in the forefront of the mind of just about everyone who wrote in this era. I forget when exactly this book was written, but sometime around the 50s or 60s, I think. And I just like to bring this up because of the overlap with my other class, one of my other classes I'm teaching now, Existentialism. Another textbook for that course, written in the same time period. That book also starts with an acknowledgement of the advent of the possibility of nuclear war. Why such seeming morbidity? Well, it's not intended to be morbid, but the advent of nuclear weapons, it launched society into what we call an existential crisis. What's an existential crisis? What's maybe another example of one even?
It's like causes a panic.
Yeah, you panic. What else?
I think an exo out, so existential, probably beyond, full control.
Yeah, it's not, you don't have control over the situation. Another thought?
It's like when you have a crisis about like the concept of like reality.
Yeah.
And like your life and stuff.
Yeah, the deepest questions that life forces upon us suddenly demand that we confront them in a way, usually because of some circumstance. Sometimes they just out of nowhere smack us in the face, and we just wake up someday realizing we have to deal with these questions. Usually it's a circumstance. And we speak of existential crises in individual people's lives. We all have had them or will have them. I can guarantee you of that. Because even if you never feel like you have one, I can guarantee you that you will die, and that would be an existential crisis. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, we have these moments when the very deepest questions that we've long been ignoring suddenly demand that we confront them. And the prospect of death certainly does that for people. Never before has society had to deal with the possibility of overnight ceasing to exist. That's basically what could happen any day. And I do not intend, the point here is not to be morbid and don't be paranoid or anything like that. That would be the very opposite of the moral of the story here. The moral of the story, and this is largely why existentialism became popular, is simply to not procrastinate any longer, considering those most important questions that your own life demands you consider, instead of just going with the flow, arbitrarily, mindlessly doing what you have to do for no other reason than you know that, well, I kind of got to do it right now. Keep doing what you got to do, yes, but also examine your life, as Socrates would say. All right, so I just like bringing up that fact that both of my textbooks I'm using for existentialism and comparative religion, the authors I don't think knew each other at all, certainly aren't writing on the same topic, but they started their books in the same way. And these books were not very well known immediately after they came out, but this book, The World's Religions, our textbook for this course, and the textbook I use for my existentialism course called Irrational Man, they both became among the most respected textbooks in their fields. All right, here, he's not talking about a societal existential crisis, because that's not the matter at hand he's writing about. He's writing about Hinduism now. But he just brings it up. He brings up the phrase that came to this guy's mind as he observed in the deep privacy of a New Mexico desert, an event that may prove the most important single happening of the 20th century. The atomic bomb was, as we say, a success, meaning it worked. A rather morbid success.
Even though I didn't like that we actually did it.
What's that?
I don't like actually we actually did it.
Yeah, it's not good, that's for sure. That's it's pretty horrible.
The atmosphere, and that's how.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we could come to a consensus on this. We haven't still in America today, that it's wrong to intentionally, deliberately kill innocent civilians, which is exactly what we've done and not apologize for. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I welcome other opinions on that as well, but we probably wouldn't get too far if we went on too much of a tangent on that. Anyway, why is he bringing this up here? Well, the first phrase that comes to this guy's mind as he's observing this happen. Does anyone remember? It's a verse from. Yeah, it's hard to say. I probably won't say it right either. The Bhagavad Gita, a Hindu text. The speaker being God. I am become death, the shatterer of worlds, waiting the hour that ripens to their doom. We are naturally inclined in the last several decades to think apocalyptic thoughts. And again, please don't be morbid and paranoid about these things, but it's natural, considering the circumstances the world finds itself in, to ponder these questions more deeply and seriously than society ever has. All right. He says the age in which this incident provides a profound symbol for this chapter's opening, and Mahatma Gandhi's life can join it in setting a stage for the faith we are about to explore. In an age in which violence and peace faced each other more fatefully than ever before, Gandhi's name became, in the middle of our century, a counterpoise to those of Stalin and Hitler. Counterpoise, meaning a remedy, a force. A counterpoise is one force that neutralizes another force. So he's of course juxtaposing these names. We have the horrendous dictators of the 20th century that no one hoped, that few try to justify. We all realize how horrendous they were. But then we also have these incredible figures on the other side of the spectrum from that same century that inspire us in the complete opposite way. Gandhi is one of the biggest. Another figure from India, she wasn't Hindu, but she was from India. She did almost all of her work in India. A Gallup poll asked the simple question, who do you admire most from the 20th century? And this single person blew away second place, actually.
If you know, there was a war between the Hindus and something else.
Yeah, so Gandhi came to be in a time of great turmoil in India specifically. But I'll just throw out there, who might I have in mind right now? Mother Teresa, yeah. She's famous in Calcutta for her efforts there to serve the poor. Anyway, great figures of the 20th century that served to in some way balance off the evil of that same century. And what that reminded us at that time is that we've been telling ourselves since the Enlightenment, in the 1800s, the end of the 1700s, that we're so smart now, we're so scientific. All we have to do is keep it up, keep up our good work of progress and everything, and we'll eventually just make the world perfect. And we deluded ourselves for a long time with that throughout the 1800s and into the beginning of the 1900s. And then suddenly the 1900s showed us how mistaken we were. By far the bloodiest century in the history of the world. More people killed during the 20th century than in the genocides and wars than all the other genocides and wars of history added together before that. So, big wake-up call to the arrogance of modern society, supposing we have it figured out. And this wake-up call manifests itself in a number of ways. The existentialism, as I said, but also people starting to say, maybe religions do have some answers that we've been ignoring for a while now. All right, so Gandhi found his answers, of course, in his own faith, Hinduism. It says here, what is much less known about Gandhi is that among his own people, he lowered a barrier even more formidable than that of race in America. He named India's untouchables. In other words, he called them, instead of untouchable, Harijan, God's people. Okay, the untouchables. A lot of history courses in high school have covered this. What are the untouchables in India?
It's like the lowest rank of the caste system.
Yeah, the caste system in India was very severe and strict, and I'm sure it is in many ways still, but Gandhi had a great influence on that. He says this, we think of Gandhi primarily perhaps as helping to liberate India from British imperialism, but perhaps the even bigger feat of Gandhi's was to help cure India itself of its own inherent structural injustice, treating the lowest classes of society as just garbage. He said these untouchables, untouchables mean don't go near them. They're unworthy of even considering as dignified human beings. He said those so-called untouchables are actually God's children. They are the apple of his eye. They're the most important part of society, the poorest of the poor. Same message that Mother Teresa had in the same place. All right. So Gandhi's own inspiration and strategy carries us directly to this chapter's subject, as he wrote in his own autobiography, that truth is the sovereign principle. And for Gandhi, he found that in the Bhagavad Gita. Sovereign. Truth is the sovereign principle. I always bring this up in my philosophy classes as well. What does it mean what does sovereignty mean? Like if a given state, a given political entity is sovereign, what does that mean about them?
Independent.
Mm-hmm. They are not subservient to another political entity. New York State is not sovereign, obviously, because it's under the dominion of the federal government, the United States. The United States is a nation. It is sovereign. So that's only an example, an analogy. He's saying truth is absolutely sovereign. It doesn't answer to anything. And nor should it. Nor should we ever pretend that it does. If you find it, in other words, what he's saying here by calling truth sovereign is that once you've found out, once you've discovered that something is true, what more do you have to do to decide whether or not to believe it, obey it, follow it, whatever? Nothing. It's true. End of discussion. It's truth is sovereign. There are no other questions to ask. There are no other considerations that should even be allowed to enter in. Sure, you have to be prudent about how exactly you go about things, but the matter itself, the truth itself, you don't have to wonder, oh, but what do my friends think about this? Is this politically correct? Will this let me fit in? Is this none of those other questions matter if something's true. It's true, period. End of discussion. It's sovereign. Truth is sovereign. Okay. India. I should mention this. So this author uses it's almost a rhetorical device. There's nothing wrong with it. It's interesting. When he's referring to Hinduism, he sometimes just says India. More than any other religion, and Hinduism is bound up especially with a given nation. There's obviously Hindus in many other places as well. But just Hinduism has a very particular relation with India. So he almost uses those words interchangeably sometimes. And it's pretty easy from the context what he's talking about, but just throwing that out there. Hinduism as a whole, if we were to compress it into a single affirmation, this is the author's own opinion, but here's what he says. If I had to tell you what Hinduism above all teaches, it would be this. Does anyone remember? Just a couple words. Yeah. You can have what you want. That's nice. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Having what we want.
Yeah, but it won't make you happy.
Exactly. But you gotta be honest about what you really want. Is what it'll throw in there a little later. And that's the important thing. And we'll get to that in a moment. But before throwing that out there, before pointing that out, they're going to be completely honest and acknowledge what everybody wants first, most basically, I don't even mean fundamentally, like deeply. I just mean most obviously, most immediately. What most people want in the shortest term is pleasure. That's what they say. But we want to feel good. We want to superficially feel fulfilled. Pleasure. Nothing wrong with pleasure in and of itself. But there's a big but after that. We'll get into that in a moment. But let's jot down for our notes just what those four ends are. Pleasure, wealth, duty, liberation. Wealth / success. Duty to community. Liberation. All right, there's the four ends. The four ends meaning the four things we're after, not chronological cessation, but purpose. The four things that we want out of life. Hinduism says it. Pleasure, wealth or success, duty two, community that is, and then liberation. This is in ascending order of ontological importance, from the least important to the most.
I know what I want, and it's what you want.
And this process inevitably undergoes certain stages. India, he says, meaning Hinduism, has not made pleasure the highest good. But this is different from condemning enjoyment. They are acknowledging it as a legitimate end. It's something what you can legitimately desire and want and seek after. So that is not immoral in and of itself. It can be immoral. There is no religion, except maybe Satanism, which is not worthy of the name religion, that tells you you can just have whatever pleasure you want no matter what, that's its own, that's self-justifying. No, sorry, every religion out there you'll ever find of any value at all says pleasure can only be pursued within the bounds of morality. You can never, the most of the evil things people do are seeking pleasure at the expense of some greater good, like maybe someone's dignity. All right, so get that right out there from the start. India, however, waits. Hinduism waits. It waits for the time. It will come to everyone this time, though not to everyone in one's present life, Hinduism says, when one realizes that pleasure is not all that one wants. It is too trivial to satisfy. And he brings up a couple quotes. I think I'll quickly read just a couple of them here because they're very powerful. So, although Hinduism is saying you can have what you want, it's also saying the time will come when you realize this is not actually what you want, on the deepest level. The time will come. And Hinduism, it says, waits for that time. It does not. This is a comparative religion class, of course. So here is a proper time to do some major comparison, and maybe consider theologically where these distinctions come from. I have this in my notes a little later. I'll try to remember when we get to this that we've already talked about it. But Hinduism is not in a rush. There is not so much of a sense of urgency in Hinduism to move on from one stage to the other. Why? What theological teaching might this not being in a rush derive from?
Reincarnation.
Exactly. Why would that make you feel like there's no rush to grow? You get what?
More chances.
Yeah, you get as many chances as you need in Hindu teaching, with reincarnation. You don't become holy now, you don't become good and saintly and virtuous now, no worries. If you at least get a tiny bit better, you'll get reincarnated into a slightly better position, and you can just, maybe 5 life cycles from now, you'll finally realize that you gotta move on to this. Maybe 10 life cycles from now, you'll finally realize you gotta move on to this. And then maybe eventually you'll finally get to what we're actually after. So there's not a sense of urgency. This is where we arrive at a stark contrast. Western religions, especially, all have a great sense of urgency. Why?
You get one life.
Well, you get one shot at life without reincarnation. This is our only chance to become what we must become. That would be the teaching in Christianity, Judaism, Islam. Would all completely agree on that. No, you only get one shot at life. You better become a saint now. You better fulfill your calling now. So there is a great sense of urgency. And there is, along with that sense of urgency, there is the teaching in those religions that no matter what age you are, you're calling to become great. And you can indeed become great no matter what age you are. There's not so much that sense in Hinduism. It would almost be kind of weird if someone on the younger side is like becoming really heroic in these virtues. So, contrast that to a couple of years ago now. I think it was a couple of years ago now. Pope Francis canonized a certain someone. And what does it mean to be canonized? Anyone want to tell us what that means in Christianity?
Recognized as a saint.
Yeah, so if someone's canonized, it's this is only done after the person dies. This happens in Catholicism, Anglicanism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and other religions as well. But when someone's canonized, the church says this person was awesome. This person was a model of saintliness. This person is to be imitated. This person lived an amazing life. Try to be like this person. They're an example. That's what canonization means. Pope Francis, as I was saying, just canonized a 9-year-old girl who died in the early 20th century. In other words, he's saying this 9-year-old became a saint. This 9-year-old achieved heroic virtue. This 9-year-old, in those short 9 years, managed to do with her life what we should all be striving after, no matter even if we're very old. That's saying something.
I think because I was a Boy Scout and I'm trying to live what I want by the Scout oath and law, to have a good life and to have that fulfilled.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
all. There's certainly lots of
pleasure.
overlap there. Lots of shared virtues between organizations like Boy Scouts and many religions. Boy Scouts, of course, doesn't present itself as a religion, certainly not, but it does present many virtues to be followed that the many religions would fully agree on. But anyway, I don't want to spend too much time talking about that contrast. I just wanted to bring it up now because it's very important that we understand just how different these teachings are. There's agreement that pleasure is okay in and of itself, but not ultimately fulfilling. But there is not the sense of urgency in Hinduism that other religions have. All right. So why specifically do we find pleasure to be unfulfilling? Well, he has a couple great quotes here. Let's see. He quotes Kierkegaard, who's actually an existentialist philosopher, saying in his book Sickness Unto Death, "In the bottomless ocean of pleasure, I have sounded in vain for a spot to cast anchor. I have felt the almost irresistible power with which one pleasure drags another after it, the kind of adulterated enthusiasm which it is capable of producing, the boredom, the torment which follow." He quotes someone else, not by name, who said, "The glamour of yesterday I have come to see as tinsel." What's tinsel? It's this cute little garbage, basically. It's this cheap, cute little stuff that you might decorate something with. It's nothing. How very honest we can be with the pleasures of the past, seeing how empty they were, and seeing how if we dared to pursue them in contradiction of justice, that we have ruined ourselves and others. It's harder to see that in the moment, because you're thinking about how much you want the pleasure you're after. But just think about how you'll feel about pursuing that particular one in the future, well after the sensation of it is gone. That's what they're saying here. You be honest about that for just a little bit, you'll very quickly realize that this first thing that we're after, not going to cut it. Not going to cut it at all. We got to move on to deeper and better and more noble ends still. Problem is, the next end, it's a little more fulfilling, but not that much. This one, more fulfilling still. But even then, ultimately, we still don't ultimately have what we need. Hinduism says. But I don't want to rush through that process, because I want to follow it through what the textbook is saying. So let me stop there. Here we are. All right, so last class we ran out of time talking about Hinduism's teaching on pleasure as obviously the first thing that we tend to want. Everybody wants it. There's no one that I know of who was born just hating pleasure, just wanting to always be in pain and never enjoying himself. So of course we come into this world desiring pleasure. That's a default demeanor. Hinduism certainly says there's nothing wrong with that. Of course, it has moral teachings. You can never pursue it outside of the boundaries of morality, certainly. And it says that this is the first end, meaning goal or purpose of human life. First, chronologically, but certainly not first ontologically, meaning chronologically, meaning, as you know, in order of time, ontologically in order of being, that is importance. It's far from first in importance. It's last in importance, actually, because we soon realize that it doesn't actually satisfy, is the teaching we left off on last class. The book shares a couple great quotes there on the emptiness of pleasure. So what do we move on to next? Worldly success. And I gave you that very first question there, what are the four ends of human life? But in Hinduism, remember, you can just have them listed for now. The pleasure, success, duty, liberation, success/wealth. Hinduism's, quote, answer to pleasure. We already talked about that, but let me give you something short and sweet for your notes here. It may be licitly meaning it's okay. If something is licit, that means it's okay. It may be licitly sought within moral bounds. But it soon proves itself empty. What leads us to seek this answer, to realize, I should have put, that it is indeed insufficient to really satisfy? Well, simply becoming sufficiently mature. Growing mature reveals its emptiness. Not wrong, but empty. A very strict stoical approach might condemn pleasure categorically, but that's certainly not what's going on here. Now, we talked last class also already about how Hinduism does not rush this recognition. There is not the sense of urgency here to grow in holiness, to grow in virtue, because the teaching in Hinduism, of course, is that there are many, infinite even, opportunities to achieve this. And it's bound to happen sooner or later. It's just a question of when in Hinduism, because, of course, of reincarnation and the many chances you get to arrive at this point. So you grow sufficiently mature to realize the emptiness of pleasure, yes, but Hinduism would also say that, well, some people, they might just not have that happen for a number of lives. You could have someone stuck in this first end of life pleasure for a number of lives, and they might, as long as they're being fulfilled by it, sure, that's fine. So that would be radically different from the teachings of most other religions. So maybe I shouldn't say most, but certainly Christianity, Judaism, Islam will urge you to grow past these lower ends of life. Even if you are pursuing them morally, they will demand almost that you realize the emptiness of them and try to dedicate your life to something more noble, because you only get one shot at life in most religions' teachings. All right. So we move on to the next end, the next goal of life, worldly success. This, too, is something that is fine in and of itself. Nothing wrong with that. But the point here is to continue to grow from one end to the next until we're at the last one there. But a few words from the book here on that second end of human life. When this time comes, this time being the time when the emptiness of pleasure is realized, the individual's interests usually shift to the second major goal of life, which is worldly success, with its three prongs. So he's defining this worldly success, itself the second goal of human life, having three main prongs or aspects: wealth, fame, power. Wealth, fame, and power are the three things within worldly success that people are after. And I think that puts it fairly enough. Those are the big three when it comes to this second step. This, too, is a worthy goal, to be neither scorned nor condemned. in Hinduism. Moreover, its satisfactions last longer. For unlike pleasure, success is a social achievement, and as such it involves the lives of others. For this reason, it commands a scope and importance that pleasure cannot boast. All right, so of course we're moving up here. It's a bit loftier to dedicate oneself to this type. And remember, this is just the for pleasure. This is not for success here. I'll get to those drawbacks in a moment. This will satisfy for longer than pleasure does, for a number of reasons. It's social. It involves other people. He points out pleasure is all about you. It doesn't even necessarily involve anybody else to just sit there and enjoy yourself all the time. What's that phrase that I learned from? I learned a new phrase from my students last year. Netflix and chill. Is that a thing? Just plop down and veg out and enjoy yourself watching stuff on a television or a computer or whatever, and eat potato chips maybe. I don't know. So that's fulfilling for a few minutes maybe, and then you start to hate your life if you do that for too long. Rightfully so, because that's a lame way to spend your life. So you start saying, you know what? I gotta be successful. I gotta make money. I gotta get power. I gotta get people that know me. So you start getting a little diligent maybe. You start working a little harder. You start sacrificing some opportunities for pleasure in the pursuit of something a little bit greater still. Yeah.
I don't believe that wealth, fame, power will lead to success.
Yeah, worldly success. So it's not a very fulfilling success. That's a good point. These are not successful in the deepest sense of the word. But this second end of life, this kind of this superficial success that you're after, of wealth, fame, and power. All right. So what's the so they're fine in and of themselves. They're not evil. It's not wrong to have or want or work for money. It's not wrong to want some more people to know you. It's not wrong to want to have a certain degree of influence over things. In and of itself, those things are not wrong, Hinduism says, but they too will reveal their emptiness in time. What are some, does anyone remember? I mean, you can share problems that you yourself would see with these, or just if you recall anything from the reading, what reveals the emptiness of even the second end of life? It's a problem with worldly success. There's one thing especially. It's a sin.
Dies or something.
Absolutely.
Time in history.
Absolutely. And in fact, that is such a serious concern that it will even arise in the third end of human life. So we'll see that especially in a moment. Some even more trivial things some even lower concerns will start to make one realize that worldly success too is not something that we really, really, really deeply want. For it to be something that we really illicitly, deeply want, it would have to be such that everyone could have it, right? Otherwise, it would be, you couldn't have the fulfillment, the most fulfilling thing in life, the real purpose of life, be something that only a few could have. That would be cruel if nature itself were designed that way, if human nature were designed that way. So that's not how it is, Hinduism would say. Wealth is essentially, so let's just make everyone rich. How about that? Why not? Let's just have the government print $1 trillion for each person. What would be the problem with that? Everyone will be rich, right?
Mm-hmm.
What would be, not $1 trillion. Let's say the government tonight prints $5 million for every single person in the country. What happens when that's done? It wouldn't.
Has no value.
There's no value. It's not even. It's toilet paper as far as you're concerned at that point.
Yeah, I don't think everyone in government paid $8 trillion to everyone will make people happy.
Yeah, so they'll be happy for about 5 seconds when they think they're rich until they realize they can't do anything with their money because money is essentially competitive. Is the point here?
Not only that, if you're giving everyone $5 million, the rich people get $5 million more dollars.
There you go.
And so everyone's still in the same boat.
Yeah, there's still a gap anyway. Yeah, and money is purely relative. It has no absolute value. It's just a measure of other things. We cannot We cannot just measure something differently and change what it actually is. We tend to forget that in our relativistic society today. So we can't all be rich. That just doesn't make any logical sense. Certainly doesn't make any economical sense. But how about the other ones? How about fame? How about let's just all be famous. Let's just have everybody be happy by making sure that everybody's famous. What might be the problem with that? If everybody's famous, nobody's famous. Because there's not enough, what is a famous person anyway? A famous person is almost by definition among the few who the many have enough time to know about. The many do not have enough time to know about the many. There's not enough time to know about many people. So fame also is intrinsically competitive, just like money.
Just like Pope Francis, he's famous.
Yeah, and you can't have too many of them, can you?
And there's like, I don't know, like 233 cardinals that all want to be Pope.
There you go. That's a good example. So you can't all have it, obviously. So it'd be ridiculous to pin as something actually worth dedicating life itself to something so competitive that only a few can have it. We all share this thing called human nature. Most religions share the conviction that it was designed in such a way that it can be fulfilled. And fame and riches cannot be fulfilled by definition by many, much less most, much less all. Power, the same exact problem. Power, not everybody can be powerful, because right away you would have contradiction. Let's just make everybody the boss. If everybody's the boss, well, same thing. Nobody's the boss. Everybody's the boss. You're all telling each other what to do, but then nobody's actually overriding anybody else. You're all just shouting over each other. Maybe that's what happens maybe that's one of the problems with like the whole social media thing, is that nobody's the boss, so it's just a big shout fest. And anyway, that's a tangent. But anyway, obviously, I think it's clear enough now, hopefully, to everyone that money, fame, and power cannot possibly fulfill enough people to be the real meaning of life. Way too competitive. All another thought.
For instance, like at work, there's only like one boss.
Exactly.
That tells you what to do at work.
So there's my point. You can't have everyone be the boss. Not everyone can have power.
That'll be too much.
So the other problem, this is not the only problem with these three prongs of success. There are other problems with them as well that make us realize we really must move on from dedicating our lives to worldly success. Competitive, yes, but I should say competitive due to their intrinsic exclusivity. All right. Riches in particular. Well, not just riches, all three. They have another problem. Not only are they competitive, but even if you happen to be among the very few who gets a bunch of one of them or all of them, and I can't speak from experience because I've never had much of any of them, nor do I want them. But I suppose, and this seems to be confirmed by countless testimonies, that once you do start getting a bunch of any one of those three, it's never what?
Enough.
It's never enough. Insatiable. Whether it's money or fame or power we're talking about, you start dedicating your life to one of these things, and suddenly you realize that the more you have of it, the more you thirst for more of it, and the more miserable you become, because you start thinking that your happiness consists in simply getting more of it. I always quote Rockefeller, probably the richest person in American history, who was asked, how much is enough? By a journalist, I think. How much money, in other words, would be enough? And his response, $1 more. In other words, it's never enough. He's always after the next thing that he doesn't have, and he's never satisfied. So it's insatiable.
I have enough money, but I'm not using it.
There you go. So hopefully, if you're not obsessed with this, you realize that it is satiable. It's satiable simply by not pinning it as your end in life. It's insatiable if you pin it as your goal in life, this worldly success. Okay, so let's see, a couple great quotes here. What did I miss? Oh, there it is. Trying to extinguish the drive for riches with money is like trying to quench fire by pouring butter over it. And I have never tried to quench fire by pouring butter over it, but I assume that would not be very wise. Butter, of course, being quite flammable. Now, I like to bring up also the example of the lottery at this point. You know, we all want to win the lottery. Well, I've never played the lottery, so I can't say that I want to win the lottery, nor do I ever plan on playing the lottery. But what happens to those who, you know, so the lottery, in other words, the tax on those who cannot do math, virtually nobody wins by definition. And yet, the one person who does win winds up getting what? Getting his life what? It's not every time, but it seems to happen ridiculously often. So you think that, oh man, winning the lottery is going to solve all my problems, and the people who actually do win the lottery, yeah, it ruins their lives. They think it just makes your life much worse. And I know that's not a guarantee. I'm not saying it has to necessarily be that way, but you see so often lottery winners' lives being ruined by that money. Well, we know because it's not going to solve our problem. Sure, a little bit more would be nice to pay a few bills a little more easily, but it's not going to solve our deeper problems. Poverty consists not in the decrease of one's possessions, but in the increase of one's greed, wrote Plato. In other words, real poverty is simply being greedy for more. Gregory Nazianzen, a theologian, actually a saint also, says, could you from all the world all the wealth procure, more would remain, whose lack would leave you poor. There's a more poetic way of putting the same thing I was trying to say earlier was wrong. So it doesn't matter how much you get all the wealth in the world, you'd still think that there's more you don't have, and not whatever it is that you don't have, if you're obsessed with wealth in the first place, is going to make you feel poor because you don't have it. It's not going to satisfy. Another one here. Success is a goal without a satiation point. That's not very quotable, but it's very wise and true. He says a psychologist pointed that out recently. Recently would no longer be recently, but well said nevertheless. It doesn't have a satiation point. You eat, and the satiation point is what? Yeah, when you're full, you don't have any desire to keep eating once you're full. These things involved in success aren't like that. They don't have a natural satiation point. So if you're not incredibly careful from the onset to make sure that you're not going after these things as your goals in life, you're always going to be unsatisfied because they don't have within themselves their own satiation point. Okay, there's a bunch more quotes here, but for the sake of time, I should probably move on from them here. He says he gives a couple more reasons why success is still not going to satisfy. He also admits, this is the author here, just describing why Hinduism in turn says that this will not be the ultimately fulfilling end of life. Same problem with the hedonism of the pleasure part of the first end of life. It's still selfish. It's selfish in a different way than downright hedonism, pleasure-based hedonism is. But you're still after these things for the sake of yourself, the wealth, the fame, and the power. It's not as intrinsically selfish because you could, in theory, use those things for the good of others. But if you're doing that, then you're on to the third step already, which we'll get to in a moment. All right. The final reason why worldly success cannot satisfy us completely is that its achievements are ephemeral. Wealth, fame, and power, as the saying goes, you can't take it with you. We're all going to die. And whatever it is that we've built up for ourselves with our fame, money, or power is not going to do us much good after that point. That much is pretty obvious. Can't take it with you. We are creatures. I've always this one quote from this book has stuck with me, maybe more than anything else. I don't know. There's a lot of quotes in this book that stick with me. But it's what he says right here that is just really profound, I think. We are creatures who can envision eternity. And we must instinctively rue, by contrast, the brief purchase on time that worldly success commands. Whatever your view, whatever your religion, whatever your philosophy happens to be on the afterlife, whether there is one or whether there's not one, what it's like if there is one, all that aside, nothing changes the fact that we are creatures who are capable of considering this idea of eternity, of never-ending existence. And the mere fact that it's even possible for us to consider that, he's implying here, means that unless we're doing something that is ordered towards that, we're always going to be restless.
The reason that I don't understand is that some religions it seems like they have steps, and it seems like to me this is crazy.
Yeah, we're all gonna be perplexed by some of the teachings of various religions, no doubt. But anyway, this
the highest
this
point,
is
and call it a different way.
Indeed. And yet there is still some highest point. They'll all agree that highest point, what it is we're after, is certainly not pleasure. It is certainly not worldly success. They'll all agree on that much. And you know, I mean, you could take these teachings from Hinduism right here. And I know he's not specifically quoting a Hindu text. He's trying to kind of compress many different teachings into some more easily comprehensible basic advice here that Hinduism would give to someone. This would be almost identical to just about any other religion we'll study here. That these drawbacks of worldly success, competitive, insatiable, not ordered towards eternity, it is limited in scope. Another way of putting it. So we can't wrap our minds around eternity, of course not. But we can comprehend the idea. I'm certain that you can all know what I mean, at least when I say the word eternity. You all know what I mean when I say that. Forever. You know you understand what I'm referring to by saying that, even if the fullness of the concept itself, of course, escapes the ability of our finite minds to fully grasp. The mere fact that idea even occurs to us is itself so utterly profound, so utterly life-changing, that he's saying we all know we have to do something to order our lives towards it, whatever, even if it's merely a possibility. A dog doesn't care about eternity. It can't even comprehend that idea. It doesn't care, and it's fine for a dog. But we can comprehend that idea, so we have to consider it. All right, so worldly success, here's the problems with it. He gives others, but we should perhaps move on here to the next path. So we're still on the four ends of human life, but now we move on to the path, not of desire, but of renunciation. So these first two things we've talked about so far, these are parts of the path of desire. So whatever is said about the path of desire is said about both pinning pleasure and pinning worldly success as your end, your motive, your goal in life. And what does Hinduism say about both of them? All of these things involved in the first two ends of life? To see these goods are like toys for children. What is the fundamental Hindu response to the contents of the path of desire? It would be to see them as goods, yes, remember, Hinduism is not condemning these things, but as goods that are like toys for children. It's kind of lame to be fixated upon a child's toy when you're no longer a child. See them as goods, like toys for children. So you get a little you feel a little sorry for an adult maybe who is just like spending his days playing with a slinky going down the stairs. I don't know. That would be better than what a lot of
I don't
adults
play
do.
that.
They're still fun. I do like slinkies, I'm
I
not
do
gonna lie.
like sneakers, but don't play it as much.
So there's all sorts of, there's all sorts of things we can draw from this analogy here as these goods as like toys for children. It could be said about any individual life directed towards pleasure or worldly success. So, Hinduism again says, as long as this really is what you're desiring, go ahead and seek them. Not at all what Christianity, Judaism, and Islam say, which is move on from that. That don't lie to yourself and pretend that you can find fulfillment in these things. You can't. But anyway, there is certainly the agreement that those are not the ultimate steps in life, the ultimate things that we're really after at the end of the day. Individuals whose development is not arrested, in other words, individuals who mature properly in accordance with their age, will move through delighting in success and the senses to the point where their attractions have been largely outgrown. And here we move on to the path of renunciation. Now, this path of renunciation can in itself be inspired by this sense, it's not, I ask there, how is Hindu renunciation different from disillusionment? Renunciation is a very positive thing. Let me erase this now just because renunciation is hopeful. Renunciation is forward-looking. Renunciation anticipates what comes next after moving on from something that is intrinsically lower than what you're looking towards in the future. Disillusionment, on the other hand, if you're just disillusioned with something, what comes along with that emotion? What is that like, being disillusioned?
To me, it's like not good at all.
It's not a good, it's certainly not good. It's not a good, praiseworthy emotion to feel. Because it's just kind of like giving up. If you're disillusioned with something, you become jaded and cynical, and you've at least been honest enough to realize how messed up this thing is that you used to kind of dedicate yourself to. So in a sense, maybe disillusionment can be a brief step towards legitimate renunciation. But if you get stuck with disillusionment, you just become another cynic. And the world doesn't need more cynics. It does need more people honest about the lack of finality in these lower goods that and these temporal things that we look to as saviors when they're not. But the mere disillusionment itself, let me give you something for your notes here. Disillusionment looks to the past cynically. Renunciation, on the other hand, this is what we're really after, to move on from the path of desire to something higher still. Renunciation looks forward positively with hope. So renunciation involves giving up something that is not necessarily wrong in and of itself. Renunciation, in other words, is different from the notion of like repentance. Repentance, the idea of repentance in many religions would be stopping doing something that's clearly wrong and asking for forgiveness for it. You're cheating. You're cheating on your tax. You're cheating people out of what you promised. You're lying. Things like that need to be repented of because they're wrong in and of themselves. But renunciation takes something that is not wrong in and of itself, but sees it as an impediment to something greater still that you could be after. So you renounce this something, even if it's perfectly fine, hoping that you can really pave the path forward to something worth looking forward to that's greater, that's far greater still. So we're onto this path of renunciation here. What does he say about this path? Renunciation entails the sacrifice of a trivial now for a more promising yet to be. Renunciation is this virtue of being willing to look at the short-term goals, the short-term pleasures, the immediate gratifications in life, as not particularly worthy of much attention and effort. In fact, not only that, but worthy of just foregoing entirely for the sake of something infinitely greater yet to come, which you'll have to delay the enjoyment of until some future point. The sacrifice of a trivial now. I'm not going to give you that for your note, but that's another quote that I've loved. All right. So what happens when we do this? Let's see what else the book says here. Skipping a few things. All right, so what he quotes, not a Hindu text, but another one. He doesn't say what his quote is from. But eventually we say, vanity of vanity, all things are vanity. And that can make us be disillusioned, or it can give us the virtue of renunciation, depending upon how we respond. Does anyone know where that comes from? That's a Jewish text there. It's either Proverbs or Ecclesiastes, but I can't actually. That's something in the, so one of the Jewish texts there, the ancient Hebrew texts. Vanity of vanity, all things are vanity. That would be King Solomon. So, that question, he says, might not perhaps becoming part of a larger, more significant whole would relieve life of its futility and triviality. Perhaps becoming a part of something, as the saying goes, bigger than yourself. We've all heard that phrase a lot, hopefully. We've all been encouraged, no doubt, to think about things bigger than yourself, to be a part of something bigger than yourself. That question, he says, announces the birth of religion. Not historically, but chronologically in one's life, asking that question deeply. As a consequence of this renunciation, when we realize just how utterly ridiculous and futile and trivial the ends involved in pleasure and success are. Isn't there more? Might not becoming a part of something bigger than myself be called for here? And the first thing that you arrive at after asking this question honestly, after seeking to answer it well in your life, is duty to community. There's our third end of life. First step in the path of renunciation. Duty to community. This is really good. This is a huge leap. This is a much bigger leap than the leap. So the leap from pleasure to success, that's one leap. The leap from dedicating yourself to your own personal success to dedicating yourself to duty, that is a much greater leap. He's saying here that leap is kind of like the birth of religion. It's renouncing yourself, renouncing these selfish ends that you've hitherto dedicated yourself zealously in the pursuit of. It is the third great aim of life in the Hindu outlook, transforming the will to get into the will to give. So this, you can be quote stuck in this third end of life and be an amazing person. Go down in history, you can be a saint and be really dedicated to this, because this is very noble. This is very good to be self-sacrificially dedicated to a greater good. Whatever community we happen to be talking about here. Could be a local community, could be your church, could be your nation, could be the whole world. Whatever, your family, certainly. Whatever. The point is, it's this sense of duty towards others. It is not selfish and self-interested. You want to give at this point more than you want to get. Yes.
You can do it all the time.
You can do it all the time. And this is universally encouraged across religion as well, in different ways, in different religions. Now, duty, the author is saying here, yields notable rewards. But he's saying it too is ultimately going to fail. And this might sound weird. You might sound like, hold on, once I'm at this point, dedicating myself to duty, what's greater than that? What's lacking in that? Well, first of all, let me pause for a moment and say nothing's lacking in it in and of itself. this perennial question between duty and the fourth step, which also the other religions will share, is there's always a tension between them. Liberation comes next, the ultimate spiritual deliverance. But it would be wrong to put those two at odds. How to be well dedicated to the good, the practical good of others, of the world, of your religious community, whatever, versus how to become completely spiritually enlightened on an even more abstract and transcendent level. In Christianity, at least, that contrast is, it's not supposed to be a contrast, first of all. Both dedicating yourselves out to the both is encouraged. But there's a certain passage in the New Testament where there are two women who symbolize both of these steps. Martha and Mary. Does anyone know what I'm talking about here? The Martha and Mary distinction. So Martha, Jesus comes to somebody's house, and Martha's all really busy serving him and everything, and Mary's just sitting there at his feet listening. And the point is, Mary in that passage symbolizes the one dedicated to the highest ends of, in this context, we would say liberation. And the Martha symbolizes those who are really dedicated to doing good deeds and a duty to others. But tradition has always said we need both. Everybody needs both. So while in the first couple steps we moved on, when we go from duty to liberation, which will be the fourth end, we're not leaving the third end behind, or at least we shouldn't. To leave the third end behind would be to say, oh, forget the world, I don't care about the world, I'm just going to go sit there and pray all day and not think about anybody else. Well, that wouldn't really be, that wouldn't be good. All right, so duty to community is, but why? Why is even this going to not absolutely and ultimately satisfy? This is so lofty and noble an end. Why wouldn't just dedicating yourself 100% to the good of the world, the good of others, absolutely, fully, and always satisfy? What might be lacking even there? Let's say you become the greatest benefactor of history. You just change the world, and you solve all of its problems. What's going to happen to history itself? Another thought.
Oh, I was gonna say, like, even if you had done all your duty to your community, you still haven't fixed yourself.
There you go. You could fix the whole world's problems and forget about your own. There's an excellent point. And I think that happens to a lot of people. They get so obsessed with the world's problems, especially like politically, maybe they could completely forget how messed up they themselves are. So there's certainly that problem. And even if you're like a pretty good person without too many problems, and you are so dedicated to duty, what's going to happen to this history, this world that you are so fixated upon fixing? It too is going to end. It's guaranteed. You could fix all the problems in the world, and you're not going to change the second law of thermodynamics, which guarantees the heat death of the universe in a finite period of time. You're not going to stop the sun from exploding in a certain number of years and destroying everything in the solar system. You're not. Human civilization went that far before those things, I'm sure. But anyway, the point is, there is absolutely no hope for the world to go on forever, in its physically speaking. So, at the end of the day, you're still going to be nagged by this thought, as we brought up before. I am a creature who can envision eternity. And unless I'm directing my efforts ultimately towards that, maybe I'm just going to be left with this lack of fulfillment somehow. He says here, hope and history. Where is the quote? Here it is. Hope and history are always light years apart. So that's even if you did succeed in everything, the problem is it's all going to come to an end anyway. But really, no matter how much you dedicate yourself to duty, you're not going to see the fruits of your labor as much as you would like, are you? No, not the greatest reformers in history have ever seen the fruits of their labors during their lives as much as they would have liked to. That's why he says here, hope and history are always light years apart. Which might sound depressing, but it's not supposed to be. Nothing in this is supposed to be depressing. It's just supposed to encourage us to dedicate ourselves to truly final and ultimate ends. In the end, even these rewards of duty prove insufficient. For even when time turns community into history, history standing alone is finite, and hence ultimately tragic. It is tragic not only because it must end, eventually too history will die, but in its refusal to be perfected. The final human good must lie elsewhere. The ultimate good that we're really after must lie not even in our duty to community, even on the largest scale. Rather, what we want is really liberation. And that's the answer to the last question. Let me give you a couple more things. Liberation or moksha. We don't have time to talk about that today. But that is what we'll dive into next class. Real quick though, before we run out of time here, let me give you a couple things for why duty ultimately fails. We talked about it already, but something short and sweet for your notes here. History itself is finite. And that aside, we can at least conclude hope, I'm just going to quote him directly, hope and history are always light years apart. I think it's clear enough what that means that it'll suffice for your notes. Hope and history are always light years apart. So, not to be depressing, we should be very inspired to duty. We should not leave it behind ever. That should really motivate us. Even Hinduism says, while remaining cognizant of the fact that it cannot be the ultimate liberator, because it's not going to satisfy that deeply. Something more still is needed. We'll talk about Hinduism's teachings on that something more next week, though. So that's it for today. Have an excellent weekend. If anyone needs the attendance sheet, it is right here. Just sign that before you go. All right, so we've talked about the four ends of life according to Hinduism: pleasure, wealth or success, duty, and liberation. Remember that Hinduism's answer to pleasure is that you can seek it within moral boundaries, but it'll soon prove itself empty. That growing mature reveals its limitations. Those limitations perhaps then inspire one to move on to the second end of life, success, or wealth even. Wealth/success. We're talking about worldly, temporal success here. What drawbacks encourage one to move on from that? Well, we talked about the competitiveness of it, that it is essentially a private good as well. It is not enjoyed for the sake of others or even necessarily with others. Limited in scope, therefore. And also, of course, it by definition ends, at least at one's death. So these two first ends of human life, this is just a review from last class, they together form the path of, what again? Desire. That's the path of desire are those two first things that we're after. So the contents of the path of desire together, pleasure and success/wealth, are like toys for children. That's the fundamental Hindu response. The contents of the path of desire, not to condemn them, but to regard them as like toys for children. Renunciation causes one to move on from these toys for children to greater things. It is not disillusionment, as we discussed. Disillusionment looks cynically at the past. Renunciation looks with hope to the future. And then the birth of religion, you could even say, quoted from the book there, is when one realizes that he must move on from this path of desire to this path of renunciation. But the ironic problem here is, Hinduism says that even this first step of the path of renunciation is not ultimately and definitively satisfying. That duty, too, will eventually prove insufficient to satisfy the deepest longings of the human person. The quote there we have, "Hope and history are always light years apart." Unfortunately, that seems to be a vindicated axiom. The final human good must lie elsewhere. And that brings us to where we left off. What people really want. There comes a time, Aldous Huxley wrote, when one asks even of Shakespeare, even of Beethoven, is this all? Why is Shakespeare and Beethoven? What is that quote supposed to mean? It does seem that the very greatest achievements that human society has to offer, as great as they are, not at all to detract from that, as great as they are, they don't by themselves, in and of themselves, satisfy what we really seem to ultimately need and crave and long for. Aldous Huxley, anyone heard of him before? Great author. I highly recommend. He wrote Brave New World. Has anyone heard of that book? It was one of the first of the dystopian novels. I believe it was written before even Orwell's famous 1984. I think it was written well before that, actually. Brave New World. I highly recommend it. Aldous Huxley. But anyway, he's got this quote here. Aldous Huxley wrote an interesting text on comparative religion also. It doesn't really work as a course textbook, but it's interesting. Anyway, is this all? We all will eventually ask that, even if we rise to the very highest heights of enjoying what society has to offer, what even the best art has to offer, the best literature, the best music. Eventually, even that is not going to satisfy. So, this, it says here, is the moment that Hinduism has been waiting for. The moment when someone finally asks, is this all? Whether pleasure, the first end, success, the second end, or service, which would be the third end of human life, but the first of the path of renunciation, all of them somehow are lacking, because the ultimate Hindu answer to the human question, that is, the deepest meaning of life, is not any one of them. It seems that what we want in and of itself is liberation, referred to as moksha. The fourth end of human life. And that is what the Hinduism is really going to focus on here. Thus far, Hinduism would say we have been answering the question of what people really want too superficially. Pleasure, success, and duty are never humanity's ultimate goal. At best, they are means to what we assume they will take us in the direction of what we really want. What we really want are things that lie at a deeper level. We want three things that themselves comprise. As I know, there's all sorts of numerical lists here. It gets a little confusing. I'm hoping I can lay it out in a structured way for you here. But this liberation consists in three primary components, and that brings us to our second discussion sheet. So let me hand that out. All right, we want joy, we want knowledge, and we want being. These are these three things that we want absolutely, in and of themselves, in completion, infinitely. So, the problem then with life is the restriction, the limitations that we find on these three things. These are what Hinduism will call the three great limitations in life. Limitations in joy, knowledge, and being. That's the answer to the first question on the top there of this discussion sheet. We want all three of these things, absolutely. Nothing can stop us from wanting these three things for their own sake, without limit, without end. So let's break apart each of them then. First of all, joy. That itself has three problems related to it. Although for a few words before we get to those. Why do we want being? He has this quote here of a group of soldiers, from a group of soldiers about to go out on a mission that, on average, only 1/4 of the people would return from. In other words, they're probably going to die. And this person in the room there with him says what he sensed was not so much fear as a profound reluctance to give up on the future. It's a profound reluctance to give up on the future. Because we need this, absolutely. We can't tolerate the idea of this going away at any point. Otherwise, it seems to somehow render everything else somewhat meaningless. Anyway, being. We want to know. We want knowledge. We want to understand things. The textbook here distinguishes between types of knowledge, though. I don't suppose anyone here has this just dire, overwhelming desire to know how many molecules are in this podium, unless I'm mistaken. You don't have that yet. Thank you. I figured no one had that overwhelming desire.
I have a desire to fix something.
Fix. We want to know if we might. Yeah, we might, practically speaking, want to be able to fix something.
It's meant very spiritual too.
Yeah, we want knowledge of things that are meaningful for us, not arbitrary facts piled up. You know, have you ever met someone who just seems to have all sorts of data in his head and like has all sorts of answers to all sorts of questions that don't really matter, and he's just like a walking encyclopedia, and yet he's just a complete idiot? I know some people like that, because mere accumulations of pointless knowledge don't necessarily do anything for us. But we do want to know the deeper truths, and we can never tolerate simply not knowing, as if that were some sort of a permanent state of our minds. We want to know things. We have this inner need to know the deepest, most meaningful truths. All right. Joy, of course, is pretty straightforward. We want to be happy. There's nothing wrong with that, and we can't actually even avoid it. Aristotle proves philosophically quite well that we all, above all, desire and crave peace. And that's what we're after. All right. So these three things. These three things we need and yet find limited, hence the problems that arise in life. First of all, let's talk about the strictures on our joy. The book goes into great detail. I'm not going to go over every single thing, but it lists three things especially that restrict our joy. And you could list many more than these three things, but these are the three things that are focused on here. Before we get to those, let me see what else he has to share with us here. Mention any good and we can imagine more of it, and, so imagining, want more of it. What people really would like to have is infinite being, infinite knowledge, infinite bliss. What people really want, therefore, is liberation, release from finitude. So, this finitude consists in these limitations we're going over now. And we'll get to the essence of what Hinduism says about this liberation, this moksha, soon. And I think I asked you for it somewhere down here. But at the essence, I suppose this would be a good time to compare religions, because this is a very contrasting teaching. What comes up next, what this liberation consists in. And yes, we'll go through the limitations on each, and there will be much more overlap in those with respect to one religion versus another. But does anyone remember the liberation consists in a certain recognition in Hinduism? The recognition of the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. And really, I should have given you that on the board. This is still from the last discussion sheet. I am going to toss that on here. Just squeeze it into your notes somewhere. It doesn't really matter where. So when we get to this point in the book, we'll talk more about that. Doesn't mean a whole lot if we haven't defined those words well. The recognition of the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. At the heart of liberation, therefore, is above all a mere recognition in Hinduism, which would certainly not be the teaching in many other religions, where the heart of the ultimate goal of human life is not a mere recognition, but a true growth, a true change, and a true transformation of the individual from something into something else. Not a different person, but a different state of one's soul. This recognition, of course, implies that nothing has actually substantially changed. You're just coming to realize something that you didn't realize before. All right. The three strictures on our joy. We have physical pain, frustration, and boredom. It lists primarily. Three strictures on our joy. Pain, frustration, boredom. I'm sure we could list more, but these are the three focused on here.
So,
Yeah, there's certainly problems. We don't want any of these things. We don't
Yeah.
seem to want pain,
those are
frustration,
all
or boredom.
lead to joy.
Yeah, so they all inhibit our pursuit of joy. And Hinduism's got some things to say about each of these. Well, no, you know, before I go over those real quick, there is a quote I wanted to share here, related to what I just said about this recognition of the identity of Brahman. The infinite center of every life, this hidden self or Atman, is no less than the Brahman, the Godhead, body, personality, and Atman-Brahman. A human self is not completely accounted for until all three are noted. All right, so I suppose this is actually the right time for talking about these terms a little bit before we get to pain, frustration, and boredom, which hopefully doesn't just define your time in Hudson Valley, maybe. Anyway, it's part of life, certainly, but we can get over each of them. All right, so Atman, the deepest self, who you actually are in your very essence, essentially. Conveniently, remember, Hinduism saying you can have what you want. Conveniently, the Atman happens to be the exact same thing, if only you could recognize it, as the Brahman, which is what? God. The Godhead, which simply means the divine nature. Not necessarily a personal God, but the divine nature kind of generally abroad. Which of course brings up the question, well, what is Hinduism anyway with respect to God? Is it monotheistic or polytheistic? And most people will answer that polytheistic because you think of all the individual gods, deities, I should say, in Hinduism. But many have argued that all the deities in Hinduism are intended to be taken as nothing but manifestations of the Brahman, which would make it almost a type of monotheism. But I'm not going to decide that question for you. I'll just acknowledge what people say on both sides of that question. Mm-hmm.
I think that's polytheism.
Yeah, so that most people will say polytheism because certainly the deities do seem to receive worship, and polytheism entails the worship of multiple beings as opposed to one in monotheism. But anyway, you could certainly there certainly are Hindus who take those all as really just manifestations, and they're very monotheistic in their understandings, kind of centralizing all of their real worship and their real prayer and everything around the Brahman, the Godhead, the divine nature. All right. But if this is true, the book says, and we really are infinite in our being, why is this not apparent? Why do we not act accordingly? I don't feel particularly unlimited today, one may be prompted to observe. And my neighbor, I haven't noticed his behavior to be exactly godlike. How can the Hindu hypothesis withstand the evidence of the morning newspaper? The answer, Hindus say, lies in the depth at which the eternal is buried under almost the impenetrable mass of distractions. Cleanse us of those distractions, and you realize that then the center can shine, quote, shine forth in full display. So yeah, you bump into a random person in the street, and that person probably doesn't strike you as particularly Brahmin-like. And perhaps we don't think of ourselves, we don't feel particularly Brahmin-like in the moment either. Hinduism, they're not, one who would argue for this is not stupid, they realize that. But they would say that the explanation of that situation is that you have simply become so distracted, perhaps by the mundane things in life, that you haven't paid any attention to the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. Now remember, most Western religions will say, no, sorry, you're not God, no matter how much you try to recognize that. But still, we'll acknowledge the teaching here. All right. So, back to where we were. Pain, frustration, boredom. Sounds like fun. Is it possible to pass beyond the strictures that separate us from these things, joy, knowledge, and being? Is it feasible to seek to rise to a quality of life that, because less circumscribed, meaning limited, would be life indeed, true life, genuine living? All right, pain, first of all. How do we deal with this? Pain's intensity is partly due to the fear that accompanies it. Ramakrishna, the great Hindu saint of the 19th century, once having a minor surgery, flinched in pain when the doctor probed his degenerating tissue. I'm taking this from the book. Then he said, wait a minute. He paused. And he said, go ahead. After which the doctor could probe without resistance. The patient had focused his attention to the point where nerve impulses could barely gain access. This is physical pain. It says, in other words, it can be overcome. Which is easy to say when you're not in great physical pain, perhaps. But still, we should acknowledge that he's right. So much of physical pain arises from the fact that we insist upon fearing its continuation, instead of just dealing with the pain of the moment. In fact, probably almost all of it. Even when we're in great pain, usually if you just sit there, stop fretting about how you're going to deal with an hour from now, a day from now, just deal with the pain of the moment. It's much more bearable than when you're shivering in fear of the notion of it continuing. Speaking of shivering, that's a perfect example. It's not too cold today, but if it were a bit colder, this would be a good example. Most of us will have to walk from this building to another one, and it won't feel great. And it's, if you're not careful, we have this response, we have this natural instinctual response to cold called shivering. It's a good instinct, right? What does shivering do? It should help warm us up. But here's the thing. You also happen to have a mind, and you can reason about things. And you can undergo a simple analysis of the situation. You can say to yourself, I'm walking from this building to the next. I'm going to be outside for about 15 seconds. There is absolutely no way that the amount of heat my body's going to lose in that time is going to be even the slightest risk to my health. So I'm going to decide to not shiver, to not freak out that it's a little bit cold. And I'm just going to deal with the slight burden that this cold is giving me in the moment. If you just go through that thought process, you'll still feel the cold. But suddenly you won't be suffering anywhere near as much as someone who just flips out every time he feels a little cold, which a lot of people do. You can overcome pain much more than people think you can. I'm not going to go all out and say, yeah, you can just think yourself out of any sort of pain. You can't. But oftentimes you can. And that often arises from refusing to sit there thinking and worrying about the pain of the future. Just deal with the pain of the moment. All right, so that's one way of overcoming it here, we see from this Hindu mystic of the 19th century. But what about psychological pain, which is worse? He says, for example, disappointments. Life is so filled with disappointments We're likely to assume that they are built into the human condition. In other words, we get disappointed so often that we might be tempted to suppose to despair of ever being delivered from disappointment. Now, there is a very simple answer to this one, which is actually perhaps more difficult than overcoming physical pain, but the answer itself is simple. And this relates deeply to Buddha's teaching also. You can only be disappointed if you what? If you have expectations. We call disappointment, and the Buddha would say we call all pain, the difference between desire and fulfillment. So you bring desire down a little bit lower, the pain, the psychological pain of disappointment is decreased. The fulfillment, however, can always go down further still. So if you want to get rid of all disappointment, don't ever expect anything. Get rid of the ego completely. And that's a very Eastern notion. You won't see the elimination of the ego to the same degree taught in most Western religions. But still, there's overlap here. And he brings up the overlap, actually, in the next paragraph. He quotes some Christian saints who encourage, he doesn't quote them by name, but he is actually quoting them. See all things under the aspect of eternity. What is that supposed to mean? To see all things under the aspect of eternity. You get a grade you didn't like, you didn't get a job you wanted, whatever disappointment, these disappointments in life, they seem very depressing in the moment we receive them. But then suddenly they become a little less depressing if you think about what?
Is this the next life?
Yeah, that's one way, certainly. You can think, man, look at when I'm 80, looking back on this, am I going to really care about this disappointment that I'm just breaking down about right now? What's that?
Something that I do care right now.
Yeah, we've all got these, so this is a very helpful thing to consider. But what he's saying here of considering all things under the aspect of eternity he's going much further. So, we all have heard that encouragement. Think about when you're 80. Are you really going to be concerned about this thing you're flipping out about now? What's he saying here is, don't think about when you're 80. Think about 800 trillion years from now. That sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's nothing compared to eternity. Consider all things under the aspect of eternity, and whatever you happen to be frustrated, whatever you happen to be disappointed about in the moment, they're going to vanish entirely from any sort of meaningful concern, as long as you've got your life ordered well in relation to eternity. All right. So that's probably a better way. Well, I shouldn't say that's another way of making psychological pain be more in place and less depressing. It's considering just how very small from the eternal scheme, from the eternal aspect, our disappointments really are. Another method he has here. How could one feel disappointed at one's own defeat if one experienced the victor's joy also as one's own? He's advocating for a certain type of virtue there. It's a very rare one, but it does help combat against this psychological pain, this frustration. It's the name of the virtue that enables you to take joy at the accomplishments of others. Or what's the opposite of that? What's the opposite of that virtue? What's the vice where you are actually saddened and depressed at the sight of the good of others? Jealousy, envy. They say that's the one vice without any corresponding pleasure. Most vices we fall into, we do because we're seeking some pleasure in contradiction to a greater good, like justice. The vice of gluttony, we want to just devour 5 gallons of ice cream at the expense of our health. But the vice of envy, we all fall into it probably, and yet there's no corresponding pleasure with it. It's just pain. You had a thought?
Yeah, there's like music in the background too.
There is indeed, yes. It's some good background music for us right now.
And
It's kind of
these
epic.
all
I
lead
like it.
to enjoy coming up just for me next month.
Yeah, so this is practical. We can all derive joy from considering this advice, I think, whether it's in a Hindu context or not. And this again gets to the great overlap in the wisdom from the various religions here. So, experiencing others' joy as your own. It takes the virtue is called humility. Humility allows you to rejoice at others' good as if it were your own. It allows you to say "good for you" and not sarcastically. That's said sarcastically so often today, like through one's clenched teeth at others, because we know we're expected to congratulate people even though we find ourselves hating them for being more successful than us, which is just utterly absurd. It's envy. It robs us of this joy that we're after. It will always, any time you allow envy into your life, it will rob you of joy. But if you can allow the opposite virtue into your life, humility, you can rejoice at other people's good as if it were your own. And that's quite an invincible safeguard against depression and frustration and psychological pain and disappointment, if you can rejoice at the good of others. So that's another method here, overcoming that second stricture on our joy, frustration. Finally, we have boredom. I'm going to read a quote here, actually. This is from a Hindu mystic. This situation he observed. Ramakrishna once wrote, we are told, he didn't specifically write this. He howled in pain when he saw two boatmen quarreling angrily. He came to identify himself with the sorrows of the whole world, however impure and murderous they might be, until his heart was scored with scars. But he knew he must love God in all sorts and conditions of men, however antagonistic and hostile, and in all forms of thought controlling their existence, and often setting them at variance with one another. Before moving on, I wanted to pause at this quote because it gets to a major contrast again. An overlap, but also a contrast. This is called, well, I shouldn't say that it's called quietism, but it's related to quietism. Quietism is the notion of radical indifference, radical detachment. Everything that happens is God's will, therefore I must not interfere with anything. That's kind of the philosophy of quietism. So what is Ramakrishna saying there? He's saying he saw two men fighting, and at first he identified with the pain involved in this, and it really scarred him. But then he said he came to this recognition that God is controlling all things, and that this is part of what must be. There's a very subtle distinction here that's nevertheless extremely important in understanding most Western religions' teaching on this. So, generally, Eastern religions do teach this radical detachment, this complete indifference to circumstances and situations because they are direct consequences of the Brahman. The general Western notion across Islam, Christianity, Judaism would be no. There are two kinds of there are two aspects of God's will: His ordained will and His permissive will. And I'm not testing on this. Don't worry. I just wanted to bring it up because of this quote. His ordained will is what He specifically and directly commands and wants. He wants you to be good, for example. He wants you to love. He wants the commandments, things like that. But His permissive will are all of those things that do in fact happen, that are contradictory to what He expressly wants, but which He nevertheless allows to happen, only because in time, eventually, He will bring greater good out of it. So you can see there's great overlap, but also great distinction between the teachings here. It seems subtle, but and it is subtle, but the implications are quite large. You don't see anywhere near as much detachment in many Western religions as you do. I just have to openly acknowledge this in some Eastern religions. No, I'm not saying that all people in Eastern religions are like this, of course not. But there's this really heavy emphasis in most Western religions on activism, getting involved, trying to change things for the better, trying to teach people what is good and insisting that they stop doing what is bad. And you don't see as much detachment and radical quietist indifference because of the distinction between the permissive will and the ordained will. You don't see that distinction as much in Eastern religion. It's kind of just the Brahmin or different words we'll use in different contexts, but this idea of just everything is exactly a certain way and you cannot feel one way or the other about it. But the Western notion would actually encourage you to feel sorrow at the pain of another. It would almost be wrong not to. But you also put a limit on how much sorrow you allow yourself to feel. You don't go flinging yourself into a despair over the evils you observe, because although you realize they are in contradiction to God's ordained will, they're not in contradiction to his permissive will, which allows all things as part of a plan for the good. So hopefully that distinction makes some sense.
Yeah. So you don't have to feel pain, frustration, boredom all the time. You
Absolutely
can
not.
actually-
We're going to get rid of all of them, in fact.
You can
Hopefully.
if you just trick your mind by saying, leave this pain, frustration, boredom out of me, and say it a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm.
You trick your mind to just
So the boredom thing, he doesn't have as much on that, but let me read what he says here. Detachment from the finite self or attachment to the whole of things. We can state the phenomenon either positively or negatively. When it occurs, life is lifted above the possibility of frustration and above boredom, which is NUI here. For the cosmic drama is too spectacular to permit boredom in the face of such vivid identification. In other words, we only get bored because we look at the mundane things of our lives and consider our lives in isolation to the cosmic plan, the cosmic whole. But we shouldn't do so because we are an integral part of that cosmic whole, the cosmic dance, the divine dance playing out on the fabric, on the if you will, the story of history that God is telling through everything that's happening. We will get bored if we get fixated upon the details that happen to pertain to this day and place and time and this, what some homework assignment we have to do or whatever. But that again is thanks only to our being distracted from what's really going on. So it doesn't have as many specific resolutions to boredom, but there's one. All right, moving on to the second great limitation of human life, ignorance. He says this too is removable. Hinduism teaches that this too is removable. Again, we can have knowledge in everything, not of all the details, not literal omniscience, he says. More probably, this Hindu teaching refers to an insight that lays bare the point of everything. It gives them summarizing insight. Having a summarizing insight makes it somewhat irrelevant to ask for the details, like, as he says, the number of atoms in a painting. So you look at, if you are a art history major, fine arts major, and you've really come to appreciate art more than you ever have in the past, and you can just stand in front of a great work of art, maybe for hours even, just drawing it all in, just enjoying it, basking in its beauty, maybe even learning from it. If you've arrived at that level of art appreciation, I'm not saying I have, I certainly haven't, but so we have someone here who has. That's awesome.
a lot of ways.
And you don't feel limited by not knowing how many atoms are in the painting. And that's, I brought up the example of atoms in the in the podium before, but this is a much better example. You bask in the beauty of a painting and you feel no lack whatsoever by not knowing the number of atoms in it. And he's saying there are insights like that lay bare all things, and we will not be pained by our absence of knowledge of minor details that we don't need to know the answers to if we have this deeper insight that lays things bare.
Once I thought I'm gonna hear pain, frustration, and boredom. I was feeling that way until I just stood for a moment and just think what I was feeling at that moment in time. And I was feeling like, oh wow, not even feeling that way.
Yeah, so overcoming this second great limitation of human life is not literal omniscience. We'll want to have this. You can have down for that third question: what is involved in overcoming the second great limitation? Not literal omniscience. Omniscience being all-knowingness, that one of the divine attributes generally referred to as God knowing every single thing. Period. That we don't need that to overcome ignorance, because rather an insight that lays bare the point of everything. And that doesn't mean that once we've had that insight, if we have had it, that we stop trying to gain new knowledge. Of course not. We always can grow. There's always more to know, and we should always be in pursuit of more knowledge. It would be ridiculous not to be. Maybe some teachings on this would encourage one to simply stop seeking after knowledge once they've had this insight. And that would be another aspect of kind of Eastern quietism and radical attachment. But that would not be the more common view of overcoming the pain of ignorance, where we have this insight that lays bare the point of things. One still strives after more knowledge. It's just that the knowledge he happens to lack at a given point no longer causes this painful restlessness that it once did. Not having any idea of what the point of things is a real pain. It's a real misery. Just wandering about in confusion as to the meaning of life, the meaning of the world. I suppose it would make it hard to get out of bed in the morning even. Once you do have an insight that gives you the meaning in your life, the meaning of the world in general, it does not prevent you from striving after more understanding. There's an old axiom: faith seeks understanding. It doesn't, so what does that say? It says that faith is certitude in a certain type of knowledge. It can be, at least. But that doesn't mean one is done striving after a greater understanding still of what the object of faith gives one. It seeks further understanding. All right. Finally, we get to restricted being. Let's get the last point we covered today here real quick. Every moment of our lives is a dying, strictly speaking, it says here. That's, in a sense, true, because we know we're going to die, and every second we're getting closer to that time. And more deeply put, Socrates would even say philosophy is dying, because in philosophizing you're separating your soul from the demands and the desires of the body. Step by step, truth by truth, good deed by good deed, separating the soul from the body. Well, death is the absolute, immediate, and literal separation of the soul from the body. So Socrates says philosophy is also like dying. But whether or not one is philosophizing, we're certainly in the process of dying, but we must not equate ourselves with our individual moments. We endure through them, experiencing them, without being identical to any one moment in its singularity. So one way we overcome this restriction on our being is by refusing to identify ourselves with the individual moments of our lives. This is similar to the teaching we brought up earlier about considering all things under the aspect of eternity. The only thing about the present moment of your life that differentiates it from all the other moments is that you happen to be dealing with the sensations involved in it at the moment. This moment will soon be the past, and it will just join ranks with all the other past moments of our lives. With the individual. Our lives are much more than the individual moments we happen to be experiencing. Reminds me of the Zeno's paradoxes in philosophy, where if he says nothing's actually moving, because if you look at any moving thing in an individual instant, it is perfectly still. So he says, like an arrow never arrives at its target, because if you look at just the very moment in time, it's not moving at all. Well, of course it's moving. The error is in supposing that the nature of a thing can be ascertained by looking at an individual instant of its existence. The existence of everything is stretched out over time, and that's how it's understood. But we tend to get very wrapped up in the moment, naturally. But again, that's an aspect of this distraction that Hinduism advises us to strive to overcome. To not suppose that you are identifiable with the particular moment you happen to be experiencing. Hindu literature is studded with metaphors and parables that are designed to awaken us to the realms of gold that are hidden in the depths of our being. We are like kings who have fallen victim to amnesia, as it says here. A child's heart is broken by misfortunes that adults would consider trivial. A lot of living is required before a child can withdraw its self-identification from the individual moment approach and thereby arrive at adulthood. Compared with children, we may be mature, but compared with saints, we are more like children. Take that same process that you underwent, realizing that you shouldn't throw a temper tantrum, you didn't get a cookie, and keep going with that process. And then maybe, instead of just being a normal adult, we'll be able to become a saint, is what they're saying here. All right, let's leave it at that. We'll pick up with that next class.